Hi, today we want to talk about utilizing a point and shoot camera with a focus on utilizing the manual settings in them. The auto exposure is great, works well, good for 90% of things you want to photograph. But sometimes you want to get a little bit more creative and you have a vision in your head. You don't want to rely on the camera because the camera has its own way of seeing and you might see it differently. And that's when the manual settings become really important to understand. So, of course, all the makes and models of digital point and shoots vary in a lot of different ways. I hope I can cover some generalizations to help you be able to access those. You might have different dials or menus, layouts, or all sorts of things that you might have to deal with. Having your camera manual can be really helpful, but you need to know what to look for. First thing we always look for, of course, is the power button, and that's going to come in a variety of different ways. I do have a couple different digital point and shoot cameras here. This one just has the power button. I slide it that way, makes a little sound, and there it is. It's powered up. I have another one here, and it's pretty similar, except it's on the back of the camera, and it says on and off right there. So, and then that would power that camera up. So they vary a little bit. All right. Now, once we get there, it's pretty common, but not on all cameras, to have a little dial on the top. So this one, if we look up here, we see we have different dials, and what we want to find is the M, and that's going to be manual exposure. We do have something S, which is typically shutter speed priority, which means I choose the shutter speed, it chooses the aperture, because we have 3 different ways to control the sensitivity and our capture. One would be time, which is our shutter speed. Aperture, which is the size of the hole in the camera. Is it smaller or is it bigger? And then we have ISO, which we can increase or decrease the sensitivity of our CCD or CMOS or whatever your sensor is in the camera, which is in front of this thing behind the lens. All right, so S is shutter speed, and then we would have, let's see, A would be aperture priority typically. Sometimes it can get confusing. A might be auto, it might be aperture priority. And then there's P, which is typically a programmable mode. Now, these are not necessarily completely universal. You do need to consult your camera guide. Sometimes they're a little bit different, but generally speaking, that's what we're talking about. All right, so I like M. I want full control over things. And so if I go to M on there, I'm in manual mode. You might not have a dial. If you don't have a dial, especially if your camera is really compact or small, it might all be through the menu. And to find the menu, this one says right here, menu. Yay, that's nice. You're looking for something like that. It might not be that specific. It might be a symbol or something. Why would we standardize these things? All right, so we have menu, and it's also the OK button here. But what I'm looking for at this point, when I put it in M, I'm looking for some numbers like these. At the bottom, you see 60 and F6.3, and then you see this little thing here. That's your exposure meter. Those are fairly common ways to lay out and give you that information. So this tells you if you're over or underexposing it. This tells you the aperture. If you see F, that is aperture. That is the size of your hole. And then you see this number here, 60. Usually that means 1 over 60. So that's 1/60th of a second. It is not 60 seconds. So that can be confusing sometimes. You might see a 2 and you're like, oh, that's 2 seconds. No, that's probably half a second. All right. If it has the little inch sign after it, 2 little dots up, 2 little lines, towards the top after it, those are usually whole seconds. So if it said 60 and had something that looked like the inch sign after it, that would be 60 seconds. But this is 1/60th of a second, which is pretty quick. All right, so you're looking for that information. It might be on your menu here. It might be in the viewfinder. If you look through it, sometimes at the bottom you see some similar information, but that's what you're looking for. So try and identify that. Your camera might give you the 1 over, 1/60th, 1/100th, whatever it is, or it might just give you 60 or 100 or something like that. So, but it helps if you can kind of identify what's going on with those. All right. So we want to manipulate those, and we have to get the right amount of light on the sensor, and that's what the light meter helps us do. So now we have to figure out how to manipulate that, and that might be challenging, depending on how you do it. I haven't used this camera in a while, so I'm just going to poke around here. That is not it. And sometimes there's two buttons you have to hit in conjunction with each other. A lot of times it's just this little dial. Usually a lot of cameras have something like this where you go left, right, up, or down. Or I might have to actually hit there. That's another button that I find kind of common, is this plus minus button. If you see something like that, a lot of times it can be associated with your shutter speed and your aperture. And that's what I had to do on this camera. And a lot of digital SLRs, the consumer level ones, will have a dial that you change your shutter speed with. But the trick is, if you want to change your aperture, it's the same dial, but you often have to hit a button that looks something like that. So you push and hold that. This camera, I just hit that, and then it gives me, up, down, left, right, the little yellow arrows there. So then I know that I use this right here, and that's going to change my aperture. And I can go all the way down to f3.5. If I go up and down, I'll change the shutter speed. You see I go down, and that gives me a faster shutter speed. Now I'm at 1/125th. If I go up here, now I'm at 30th, 20th, 10th. I'm going to try and get to the whole seconds, and 1 whole second. So now you see how I have that little inch sign after that? That's what you want. So 1 second at f3.5. That's letting in a lot of light. That's like if you're in a dark room and you need to do a longer exposure and get a lot of light on there. That's what you're looking for. You might even need a lot more of that, depending on how dark your room is. If I keep going, I don't know how high, wrong way. We'll see how many. I think it's probably 8 seconds. Oh, this one only tops out at 4 seconds. Not very good, in my opinion. Sometimes I like long exposures. All right, so this one goes up to 4 seconds, opens up to 3.5. The next thing we'd like to find is like, well, my room is really dark. That's not enough. You have one other option that might help you out. It should help you out. Up here we see it says ISO 100 up there next to the 7 megapixels, ISO 100. That is how sensitive your CCD or CMOS sensor is to light, and we can change that. You're like, well, great. Why would I choose anything other than something really high? Because higher makes it more sensitive. Well, because you typically lose image quality the higher you go. But sometimes that's what you have to do to get the image that you want. All right, so now I have to figure out how to gain access to that. And that's probably means going into the menu, I'm going to guess. I'm just playing around here. I'm in the menu. I see white balance, which can be helpful. High speed shooting, autofocus sharpness, flash bracketing setup. Ooh, I didn't come across what I wanted. Okay, so what other options do I have? This F button. Oh, weird. Who would have known there's this little F button? And I hit that, and I have this vague recollection of having to do that in this camera. So if I hit that, then I go back to this multi-selector, is usually what this thing's called. I hit it, and then you see, oh, look at that. I've got 100, 200, 400, 800, 1600. This is a pretty old camera. A lot of the newer cameras go up to 3200, 6400, 12,800, 25,600. It's the doubling and the halving of these things. Well, they of course relate to exposure and stops, and the doubling and halving the amount of light that hits the sensor inside this. Each one of those numbers is called a stop of light in photography. So one stop is either halving or doubling the light. So if you ever hear me talk about stops or someone else talk about stops of light, that's what they mean. So that makes perfect sense here where the numbers change, 100, 200, 400, you see doubling, halving. Makes sense in shutter speed, 1/60th, 1/30th, there's one stop difference. 1/60th, 1/15th, that's 2 stop difference. It's photo math. All right, so that's good. The apertures, unless you're a math person, they make no sense. They're apparently logarithmic. So you'll have f8, f11, f16. The difference between f8 and f11, 1 stop. The difference between f8 and 5.6, 1 stop. The difference between 5.6 and 4, 1 stop. You just kind of have to learn those numbers, unless you're really good with, that sort of math. That might make sense to you. Doesn't make sense to me. All right. But anyway, so those are my primary tools for exposure and getting the right amount of light. You're probably not usually shooting in a really dark room, so you may not need to go up to 1600 ISO or 3200 ISO or whatever it is. Faster shutter speeds, they say you shouldn't handhold anything less than 1/60th of a second. We think we're all still. I still do it all the time. I'm like, oh, I can hold it for a quarter of a second. And, I'm like, I'll try really hard. But it's never quite as sharp as if you put it on a surface, a tripod, a table, something like that. If you're doing long exposure, something less than 60th or 30th, try and set it on something, because you're not still. You can maybe hold your breath, but you can't stop your heart beating, and that creates little motions, which creates softness in the image. So, all right, so be aware of that. Okay, so there's a general overview. One thing we didn't cover is if you want to see your image, usually that's this little, there's a, just that triangle, that green triangle right there. If you hit that, that's typically the playback, and that's fairly universal in cameras. And there's other modes in here, flash, things like that. But basically, to get you started, that's what you need.